Yeah, I mean, say I spent some time there. I did a 4-day trip, which scared the living daylights out of me. Is probably one of the dumbest things I've ever done. I would never do it again. I would counsel anybody I know probably to never do it. But then paradoxically, I'm so grateful that I saw it and experienced it, because it's, another example of rivers, which we all love and enjoy, which was just mind-blowing. Just mind-blowing.
Hello, and thanks for joining. Today's episode is with one of the best kayakers you may have never heard of. His self-induced kayak affliction has taken him all around the globe, finding some of the best whitewater on the planet. And he's here with me today to share some of his unique experiences. But first, today's episode is sponsored by Four Corners Riversports. To me, Four Corners is exactly what a paddling shop should be. It's staffed with dedicated river people who know the sport inside and out and are all about having fun and getting people outside. Four Corners Riversports is located in Durango, Colorado. They are a full-service paddle sports retail and rental store. If you're looking to get out on the water, look no further than Four Corners Riversports. Call them at 970-259-3893 or visit their website at www.riversports.com. This episode is also sponsored by Taylor Barker with the group real estate Steamboat. I've known and paddled with Taylor for years, and he brings passion to everything he does. Steamboat Springs is a wonderful town with the Yampa River running right through it and has a vibrant and friendly boating community. If you're thinking about making a move to Steamboat or purchasing a vacation home, be sure to get in touch with Taylor. He's happy to give you a lay of the land, the real estate market, and help you find the perfect property. You can reach him at 336-314-4353 or by email at taylor@brokerintheboat.com, and you can find these links in the show notes. This podcast is being featured on paddlinglife.com. Paddlinglife.com does a wonderful job of finding all the most interesting happenings in the world of paddling and bringing them straight to you in the form of news, interviews, articles, videos, and more. Check out paddlinglife.com. Now, what you've been waiting for, on to the show. Hello, and welcome to Tales from the Crips, a whitewater storytelling podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Cripps. For those who are not old-timers in the world of whitewater kayaking, my guest today might be the best
Come
kayaker
on, age-related
never
already.
Heard of.
Go on.
No mercy on this podcast. So I have a personal anecdote about my guest Alex today, because I met him a few years back on Clear Creek, which is just our little local Colorado Front Range run. It's near Golden. We were there after work. The flow is a respectable level. And he shows up, and he's got this old Dagger red line, if I recall correctly. I got a nod there. And that's a playboat circa late 90s or so. And you don't see them too often.
No, it's not a playboat, but carry on.
Oh, okay. It would be a playboat by today's creek boat standards.
Right.
But it's, maybe a little undergunned for the average person on this class 4 or 5 section at the level, but reasonable. And when we got on the water, I saw him getting out there and surfing every little wave that was hard to reach and like moving around the river with a lot of grace that you don't usually witness. And so I pulled into an eddy at one point with my friend Cruz, and I said, "Hey, Cruz, that Alex guy, he sure looks like he knows what he's doing." And Cruz kind of chuckled, and he said, "Yeah, when I was a kid, I had a poster of that guy hanging on the wall in my bedroom." And we both kind of laughed, and then he went on to explain that, that Alex was part of the crew that was out on the Zambezi River when Steve Fisher was out there, and they were figuring out, all these new playboat moves and things that you could and couldn't do in a kayak, and it was kind of a important time in whitewater history. And Alex, since, as you could guess, he's traveled all around the world, ran all kinds of iconic rivers and in whitewater kayaking, and he's even produced a number of seminal whitewater kayaking videos in the, I think, early 2000s. Wicked Liquid, among others, that featured, showcased a lot of the things that were going on in the sport at the time, which was pretty cool. So all these years later, a few years later, Alex is he's still out there having fun. He's still out there kayaking, and he's agreed to sit down with me today to share some of his adventures. So Alex Nix, thanks for coming and welcome to the show.
Howdy, thank you so much for having me. I just want to say Cruz's picture of me on his wall was probably next to a poster of Duran Duran or something like that. Just to put it in context.
I don't think Cruz is that old. Come on.
No, thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, this is awesome. So I'm first just going to start out with the elephant in the room because, when I hear your name come up, you would think that it would be about the Zambezi or some cool expedition that you've done, but more often than not, it's about something different. So I've got a special guest host here, my daughter Kate, who is going to ask you a question because it happens to be a passion of hers.
Hi, Kate.
Come over here to the microphone.
Hi, Alex. I hear that we share a common trait. When I went camping with my dad last summer, we did a hike near Breckenridge, and I did it barefoot. Everybody on the trail kept asking me, "Where are your shoes?" as if there was something wrong with me. But I like hiking barefoot. What's wrong with that? I heard that you also like to be barefoot, and not just when kayaking easy rivers, but also in major expeditions. I hear that you did the Middle Kings, which requires more than 10 miles of hiking with a loaded boat over a mountain pass, with only a pair of sandals with you for when things got rough. Is that true? And how did you get hiking barefooted, and is it safe?
Well, it is kind of true. Jesus wears sandals. I was in flip-flops, but great job on the question, so thank you. You want me to talk about why I'm barefoot most of the time?
Of course. We got to get this out of the way.
I mean, it looks pretty eccentric to people that are gear hungry, but there's a pretty rational reason behind it. The first one is I'm 6'2", 6'3", and the older playboats, which were very slicey on the end, there was just no room for my feet in those boats with shoes, so I learned to paddle without them. And then the biggest one is being a video boater on the Zambezi. You can't wear shoes video boating there because the water goes through this huge vertical cycle over the year, and the low water run, which we're talking 10,000 CFS plus, when you're walking over the rocks, they've generally been brushed and polished at high water for about 6 months of the season for millennia. Yeah. And so those basalt rocks are super slippery. So, I learned quite quickly wearing shoes, you just slip up and bash yourself, and you damage camera gear as well doing that. So
I imagine there were no good rubber shoes, no 510s at the time.
Not really. And it's just you're under a little bit of pressure with the raft trips. They don't want to wait for you, so you don't have time to put shoes on. So you kind of get out, scuttle, go and find your spot, film, and run back again. And I think it's a skill that isn't bad, actually. You learn to feel the ground under you a little bit, and when you're on less solid terrain, when stuff can give, you sense when it's going to move or shift. So your feet toughen up. I'm not anti wearing shoes. It just worked for me.
The safety gurus out there, might take issue with you. What's your rebuttal? The safety gurus, the people that say, like shoes, good footwear are part of the essentials for kayak safety. What's your rebuttal?
My rebuttal to them would be, if that works for you, good for you, mate. You carry on. We had this saying when I was younger, all gear, no idea. There's an element of truth to it. You don't have to have all the gear to be super effective on the river. You just got to have the right gear.
Yeah. Do you think that anyone has this power? I mean, a lot of people would say hiking through something like the Middle Kings with only a pair of sandals or flip-flops would be like impossible for an average person. Do you think that you're unique, or do you think that you've just done it enough that if anyone did the same thing, they could do that?
I think I'm just cussed enough. I've had enough experience. I think anybody could do it. Part of the fact as well is the Kings is it's a long multi-day self-support, right? So you've only got so much room. So
talk about a weight weenie.
yeah, exactly. Exactly.
That's awesome.
But again, I just got into that habit from the Zambezi of having to hop out quickly for a scout, pull your boat up. You don't have to.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And cold isn't an issue out there.
No, exactly. Not in California either, really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so I've only met you once, twice, maybe, just briefly, and so I hope
I wasn't rude to you.
Well, I invited you here in spite of it. So, But I don't know. I don't know much about your background. I think I'd love to hear. You've obviously dedicated a good part of your life to paddling, and how did you get into the sport?
Yeah, it's a disease for me, or has been a disease for sure. I guess it's kind of unusual by North America standards, but in the UK, there's quite a lot of opportunity to kayak, and we produce quite a few great kayakers, I think. Mm-hmm. But for me, I was lucky enough to go to a high school where we had a kayak instructor.
Oh, really?
So beyond those very traditional sports of rugby, cricket, and hockey, there was an opportunity to kayak in the later years, and for some reason it clicked for me. I didn't like the team sports. I felt like I was waiting for the ball to be passed to me too much of the time, and when you're in the kayak, you're driving it and playing with it all the time, and it just sort of clicked straight away. Yeah.
And then where did it transition from just something you did in high school to something that was more of an obsession or a lifestyle? Or disease, as you call it.
Yeah, affliction. So my parents bought me a kayak one Christmas, and I did live on a farm that had a river going through the farm. And I had a friend whose parents bought him a kayak who lived downstream, and I had a friend whose parents bought him a kayak who lived upstream. And we used to converge at a low-head dam and basically try and drown each other and kill each other and dare each other to do the dumbest things on this low-head dam as teenagers. Left home, went to university. There was an active canoe club there, kayaking in Wales and Scotland, and the Thames Weirs you probably don't know of, but they're sort of relatively well respected as good play spots in Europe, and regularly hold rodeo competitions on places like Hurley. So I competed there and got a degree in geology, and afterwards all I wanted to do was just travel and kayak. So it developed and formed at that stage, and like a lot of Europeans do, either pre-university or post-university, they'll do a round the world trip, and I picked as many mountain zones as I could to go to over about 6 to 12 months.
Very cool. Yeah. So this is a good transition then into kind of the next thing I think would be great to talk about. As you already alluded to, you spent a lot of time in the Zambezi, and this was not just any time in the Zambezi. This was a unique time. Steve Fisher was there. It was kind of an important moment, I think, in kind of kayaking in terms of progression. How did you... There's a lot in that question, actually, for me to pick up on. So it was as the boats were evolving as well. I mean, the paddlers were coming in and helping develop the moves, but the boats were evolving. So clearly, Steve, everybody knows quite well. He's had great presence and done some amazing stuff. But there's a lot of people that came before him that are quite important to mention, that are involved in that transition of boats. So... to a lesser extent, but was an equally fantastic paddler, was Nico Chassing, the French paddler. And he was on the Zambezi before I arrived there. And I was on the Zambezi before Fisher arrived there. And we sort of ended up competing quite strongly against each other. But I think it's really important to mention other paddlers like Colin Chill, and particularly Oliver Foyette, who is a French paddler, hilarious, slightly eccentric, and demented with fiberglass. So he was one of the first kayakers to chop down a slalom boat and bring that out to the Zambezi. And that was the first sort of sub 7 foot, 6.5 foot boat that had been on there. Really?
And was ultimately, and Corin will hate this, but ultimately what influenced Corin Addison into chopping down the short boats that came, and he sort of introduced to a larger market.
Interesting. Yeah. No, that's great. That's history I didn't know anything about.
Yeah.
And
Ollie Fiat was so... maybe he'd smelled too much fiberglass glue and fumes, but he used to make his own fiberglass framed glasses as well as his own helmets. He was just a machine with that stuff. And he was bending the boats in different directions and, using flatter hulls.
So what first brought you out to the Zambezi?
So again, post-university, I did a round-the-world trip. I kayaked in Canada, New Zealand, and Nepal. And while I was in New Zealand, I met this shaggy Chewbacca lookalike from South Africa called Stan Ricketts. And he had just finished his job as a video boater on the Zambezi, and his space was going free. And I'm like, do you mind? And so he set me up with a contact for the Zambezi. And this was back in 1994, I believe.
Okay.
And so to get in contact with these guys, I had to hike half a mile from the campsite where I was in New Zealand, take about a kilo of Kiwi dollars with me, and go to a payphone and call Zimbabwe and just keep feeding these coins in. And I eventually got somebody, and they said, yeah, send us a fax. And I took Stan's job and ended up on the Zambezi, and I'm glad I did.
How many years were you there? This was a recurring gig, right?
Yeah. So I did 3 years in Zimbabwe, on the Zimbabwean side in Victoria Falls, and then 2 years on the Zambian side in Livingstone. So it's interesting, we had this sort of core interest, this love of paddling on the river, but always kayaking, when you follow it, takes you to these most interesting and incredible places that you wouldn't choose to go to otherwise if it wasn't for your kayaking.
Yeah.
And so because of that, I've had this opportunity to see, African politics in action. So my first 3 years in Zimbabwe, I absolutely loved. I adore Zimbabwe. The people are fantastic. But it was as Mugabe, or Robert Mugabe, the dictator, was becoming more and more unhinged. But one of his policies was no work permits for foreigners, so we were all kicked out of the country at the end of our third year. Zambia was slightly different, so we just moved across the river and ran trips from there. But you learn about different parts of the world that you just wouldn't otherwise see or experience.
Yeah. That's definitely one of the attractions that I never occurred to me when I started paddling, but very quickly became apparent once you start traveling to especially out of the country and discover.
Yeah.
Like all of a sudden, instead of you looking around at other people and trying to see what's going on, people are actually looking at you, saying, "What are these guys doing?" And I think it's a different way to experience a place.
Yeah, for sure.
What was the state of the world of kayaking when you first arrived there? I mean, what was when you talked about play boating, when you talked about creeks and river running, kind of what was the state of the sport at that
it's quite
point?
Interesting. I mean, I would definitely have a sort of Anglo perspective. So, Sean Baker was the guy that was doing the extreme stuff. A lot of the guys that I looked up to and aspired to be were the Nepali explorers. So some of the British guys like Pete Knowles and Dave Manby, who had done a lot of the Himalayan kayaking. But it was changing, and I think, there was an industry that was beginning to grow that was viable, and so boats were being designed and evolved each year and were changing, and competition was beginning to evolve as well and have more input to it. So when I first arrived on the Zambezi, I had a Piranha stuntboat, which I think is maybe 7.5 feet long.
Okay.
It was considered a playboat, and the person that picked me up from the airport said, "That's far too short. You can't paddle that on the river." I'm like, yeah. People who tell me what to do don't come off well, unfortunately.
But the evolution was starting in terms of
for sure. And again, that contribution by Ollie Fayette, by chopping boats down and making them, the length of your feet, was a huge part of that. Yeah. And that was happening while I was there. Corin was doing a lot of stuff as well, and Nico was demoing some of his quirkier designs, which were, they were out there. He was doing really interesting, really cutting edge stuff.
Do you have any stories from that time that kind of epitomize some of the characters or things that were going on in the sport?
After a beer, maybe. I mean, the Zambezi. Well, I was there because I love whitewater kayaking and love doing hard kayaking, and it was the same for Nico and Steve and for a bunch of other paddlers. But there were a lot of people. Our ability to be there as a kayaker was based around this rafting industry. So we were either making our income as a video kayaker or as a safety boater. So it was secondary to this crazy rafting trip where you see the river do things to rafts that you would never see anywhere else in the world, Americans call a tube stand where it flips edge over edge. We call a tube stand where it flips on the vertical plane. So the boat will rise 16 feet out of the water and then flick people on the top end back into the upstream rapid. And that would happen on a daily occurrence. And so as a video boater, I mean, it was...
I hope they had a good waiver that you had to sign.
Yeah, it might have been written in African. I don't know for what it was worth. But yeah, I mean, we were young and dumb and enjoying being on just one of the most beautiful, insane, forgiving rivers on the planet.
Yeah. I saw, I remember, I don't remember how long ago that was. Maybe it's probably 10 plus years ago, right? There was that Scott Lindgren video, The Black Book, that was kind of a little biopic on Steve Fisher, but a big part of that was obviously the Zambezi stuff. And I was pretty captivated at the time by the images I saw of that, especially, the Minas Rapids and that place. Were people running the Minas Rapids at the time when you were there?
Yeah, I think there was a group that went in my first year and did the first descent of it. I think Nico Shassing again was on that.
That was the first year.
Yeah, pretty much. It's one of those funny things. I mean, it's right there in front of you. You put in below it every day.
Right.
And it's spectacular. I mean, huge volume class 5 with Victoria Falls dropping 700 feet right behind it. But then to your left, you've got some of the best play waves in the world. So people just kept turning left and going down there and didn't really feel the need to go up to the Minas Rapids.
Yeah.
So I think that was about the first time they were run.
Was it, were there a lot of close calls at that time when people were kind of pushing some of those limits, probably pushing flow levels too of what lines get run?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one of the most magnificent things that I don't think people understand about the Zambezi. They're obviously aware that it's a huge river. I don't think people are aware of this insane vertical cycle on the river. So you're talking a 4,000 kilometer river. You're about halfway through it there at Victoria Falls, approximately 2,000 K, give or take. It's wide. It'll be, I don't know, about 100 feet wide, but it'll go for a vertical cycle in that canyon of up to, or maybe more, 8 meters over the season.
Wow.
So at the beginning of the season, you can be paddling on this huge volume river next to a house-sized rock, but as the season progresses, you'll see it become this insane pour-over that you'll want to avoid, then you'll want to boof, and then it'll become a huge hole, and then as the river comes up even more, it'll push out into a beautiful green wave.
Wow.
And then towards the end of the season, it can be gone, and you can be paddling over it.
It's amazing.
And I think what happened was, the industry was developing, video kayakers were sticking around, and people were running it in the closed season. And it isn't technically difficult, but it's like an ocean. I mean, it is heaving hundreds of feet across the channel for miles. It's amazing. Yeah,
very cool. That reminds me of I've never paddled out there, but I'd like to, especially before the dams come in and kind of ruin. Sounds like a good part of it.
Yeah, it would be a tragedy. It would be an absolute tragedy. We hope that Africa reliably can snatch defeat from the jaws of victory and mess it up somehow, but it's very tempting damming projects, especially in more corruptible nations where the person signing the document over for the loan can take a backhander and let everybody else deal with it later.
Sure. Yeah. It's unfortunate. All right. Well, you can say no comment to this, but just because we're on the subject, do you have any comment on the Dreamline fiasco and the Steve Fisher project that fell through?
It's not that I don't have no comment. I just didn't really follow it, and I don't know the machinations of it. So
you haven't been a part of any of that.
I was nothing to do with that at all. Yeah.
What do you? Does it ring? No, knowing Steve, does any of that
that's a definite
surprise you or not surprise you?
That's a definite no comment.
Okay, fair enough. All right. Well, sticking in Africa, but moving on. I don't even know much about this, so you'll have to kind of guide me. But you spent some time at Murchison Falls, which is just a famous section of whitewater, a spectacularly difficult section of whitewater.
Yeah, I mean, to say I spent some time there. I did a 4-day trip, which scared the living daylights out of me is probably one of the dumbest things I've ever done. I would never do it again. I would counsel anybody I know probably to never do it. But then paradoxically, I'm so grateful that I saw it and experienced it, because it's, another example of rivers, which we all love and enjoy, which was just mind-blowing. Just mind-blowing.
So talk a little bit about the where is it? What river is it on? What's kind of the significance of the area?
Yeah. So the Nile comes out into the Mediterranean in Egypt, but as you follow it back upstream, it splits, and you have the Blue Nile that is sourced in Ethiopia and comes out to Khartoum, and then you have the White Nile that starts at Lake Victoria in Uganda and comes down through southern Sudan and meets the Blue Nile in Khartoum. Now, at its source, the Blue Nile is bigger. No, I've got that wrong. Sorry. The White Nile is much, much bigger than the Blue Nile.
Okay.
But it goes into this huge swamp called the Sud, the size of France, in southern Sudan, and it evaporates most of it, and it goes out into the Congo. And so when the White Nile and the Blue Nile meet in Khartoum, the Blue Nile is actually bigger. But upstream of that swamp, up until recently, and a lot of damming projects, it was very famous for the Bujagali Falls section, which made the Zambezi look small. Mm-hmm. And so that was kind of it became a very famous sort of destination kayaking spot, because it was logistically easy. The whitewater was incredible. And, the Uganda's a fabulous African experience. The Ugandans are awesome people. And as a legacy of African politics again, Idi Amin, I think, had dropped a lot of bodies of people he hadn't taken kindly to in the river. And it had been good for the crocodiles, but they'd had to clear them out because of that. And I think there's all sorts of stories about helicopter gunships killing crocodiles, about people killing crocodiles.
Oh, really?
But it's a sort of unusual to have a big river in Africa with no crocodiles in it. And so that section has very, very few crocodiles. So that's a great destination. Kayaking spot that has sadly been mostly destroyed by dams. However, if you go downstream, several hundred kilometers, there's a section in a national park called Murchison Falls. And it's called Murchison Falls because it has the entire Nile goes through about a 20-foot gap and drops about 600 feet. Wow. And the takeout is just above that. Wow. And so you do a 4-day trip down through to that. When I was there, on the right-hand side of the bank, the river was controlled by the Lord's Resistance Army, which is a lunatic fringe separatist movement in Uganda who were dangerous and actually got involved with another river expedition, shot somebody in a later expedition. And then it's in a national park. And so every eddy, there's nobody there to hunt crocodiles or hippos. So every eddy, without exception, has a hippo or crocodile in it.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. So you would normally run a mile from that, but I'd seen the whitewater from the air flying out commercially one year. My jaw just dropped. I'm running up the plane, looking out the window, leaning over people's laps, just trying to get the best view of it.
And so it looks good to go from there.
Yeah. So I had South African friends who had done the first full source to sea on the Nile, 6,700 kilometers. I think it took them 4 months. Wow. And they went through that section, and they said, by far and away the most spectacular whitewater on the entire river, but that they'd ever seen. And so, we had to go at it.
Quite a statement.
Yeah, mind-boggling. Really. Again, it's stuff that makes the Zambezi look small. You put him below, a cataract that's probably a vertical drop of about 50 to 100 feet that splits into 3 or 4 channels. And we put him below that, and we took a raft as support with the late and great Hendrik Coetzee, who we lost on expedition with Ben Stooksbury.
Yes.
And his very close buddy Pete Meredith, who had been a friend of mine, rafting on the Zambezi.
Okay.
And then a female guide, Jane Dicey. And then we went with Tyler Brad, and I'm trying to think who else we had on the river, but there was a small gang of us, and the plan was to run the whitewater. Seth, let me come back. But the plan was to, run the whitewater and jump on the raft in the pools and sort of theoretically be safe there.
Does that work?
Well, we're here.
But was it by luck or?
But you only have to Google stuff, and I think you can find crocodiles coming up to the boats.
Yeah.
Definitely a little bit of luck, a little bit of judgment. But we had an oar frame on a 16-foot raft. They had 2 oars and a spare oar. They broke 2 oars within the first 3 miles. So then they had to paddle boat it from there. Huh. So that added an element of excitement to it. It's hard to get across without showing pictures of this stuff, but you're talking about waves that run, again, kind of Zambezi volume, 200-300 feet across the river.
Huh. That's mind blowing. I can't even imagine that.
Yeah.
And then, did you feel at that point that you had some capability to do that, having spent a lot of time in big water in Africa?
Yeah, this was sort of 3 years probably after I finished on Zambezi, so I was pretty competent at that stage. Yeah. So the whitewater wasn't. That was a reasonable decision, I think.
Okay.
The wildlife is a misnomer. I think a great story that highlights it. We got to one of the last rapids above Murchison Falls. It was like a 15-foot shelf that came out from the bank. Pretty easy run in, and then sort of went out into a big wave train afterwards. And as we got there to scout it, there was an eddy below on the left, below us. And these hippos started rising out of the eddy just to check out who we were. And then they started swimming into the wave train to get away from us into the center of the river. So they're kind of swimming across this class 4-5 wave train to get away from us. And then one of the hippos stopped on a rock in the middle of the river with this water billowing up over himself, took a look at us, and then just carried swimming across again.
Amazing.
So, they've evolved to be in the whitewater there, basically.
That's incredible.
Our safety aspect of being in the whitewater that we had in our mind was false.
Yeah. All right, so moving on. You mentioned to me that you did an expedition in Iran, or I think Iran. I once worked with someone. He got very angry at me.
Iran.
That I said Iran.
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 There you go. From someone who's been there. So yeah, I know there's mountains in that country, but I certainly have never heard of anybody kayaking there. So how did this trip come together?
So always a story, right? So again, one of the guys I mentioned earlier, this English character, Dave Manby, who was a sort of prodigy might be too strong a word, but he was a paddler in the 70s, 80s that did, I think it was the first descent of the Dudkosi, which is the river off Everest. Oh, really? He was certainly well known for a lot of the descents he'd done in the Himalayas. So he was kind of an icon in the background there. And a friend of mine, Deb Pinniger, was very good friends for his, who former ladies world champion, British team kayaker. And they were working in eastern Turkey. And Dave was running trips on the Çorum River, which I think now sadly is dammed as well. So the Çorum in eastern Turkey. And once his season had finished there, eastern Turkey is just a drive across the border into Iran. And so, most kayakers, they'll do a river a couple of times, but they'll start looking at maps and seeing what's around the corner. Yeah. And I don't know what led him to go into Iran, but he did this river, the Bakhtiaria, which was a 9-day self-support trip that they did. And he came out of that saying it was one of the best river trips he'd ever done.
Really?
And through my contact with Deb, I got invited on the trip they wanted to do the year afterwards, possibly because he wanted some footage of it as well. And it's up there with one of the most spectacular river trips I've ever done. And of course, again, folded in with that travel cultural experience around getting to the river, which most people think you're insane actually, but it was a great experience.
What time period was this?
So this was just as Daniel Pearl, the journalist, had been beheaded during the Iraq War.
Perfect timing.
Yes, things were kind of heating up a little bit, and I had misgivings about the trip, but I thought, I go to eastern Turkey, and if people are throwing stones at us and telling us to go home, then I'll go home. But it's just not the way it works in an Islamic country generally, which is what most of the people will tell you about the Indus. I mean, the travel experiences and their stories are just they're overwhelming.
Yeah, well, that's exactly where I was going with it. Yeah. What are the logistics of getting to the river?
To the river. So, if you include going to the Iranian embassy twice in London to get vetted and get your visa, and then driving from eastern Turkey to the river, and then sort of wait to the border, and then waiting about 8 hours at the border for them to check everything out again. We took Dave Manby's van that he used for his rafting operations, and we drove 4 or 5 of us across the border, and then drove down to a little town in the southwest called Sepidasht. And if you imagine Iran as an inverted triangle of mountain ranges with an elevated desert in the middle, we were in the southwest. So the most left-hand side of that inverted triangle are the Zagros Mountains, which have been pushed up by Red Sea geological movements.
Huh. And what's the climate like? What's the environment like there? Is it just pure snowmelt? I picture that country as being quite dry, so I can't imagine there's any tropical places in there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're spot on there. It is very dry. There are ski resorts north of Tehran. I don't think people know that. So they get very good snow basically in the winter, and most of this will be groundwater and snow melt. Yeah.
So otherwise, it's pretty arid though, where the river is starting. And,
very. It's like paddling in the southwest.
Yeah. Is it what kind of volume rivers? Or what?
So we did 3 in the 6 weeks we were there. I was, I'm trying to remember the name of the first one we did, but they were medium volume, so about 3,000-4,000 CFS, and then we did a creek at the end of it, which was probably 500 CFS.
Okay. Yeah. And what kind of grades are we talking about?
Creek was class 5. It's class 4 generally. There was some class 5, some portages that were possible to run on it. So it was an expedition, so we weren't going there for the craziest whitewater. There was some aspect of that to it, but it was about the journey more than the whitewater.
Did you have any kind of beta on these going in besides looking at topo maps?
Well, other than this one run that Dave had done before the Bakhtiari,
okay.
We knew about that run. Yeah. And that was always his pitch for the story, that it was a first descent for them. And it was very difficult for them because it pinches off into these vertical walled canyons that are very narrow, and it keeps doing that. So they never knew whether these canyons were going to end in Killer Phu Fang Falls, and that was going to be the end of them. But they made it through this 9-day trip and took us back. But it was spectacular,
How many do you have in 9 days? Do you have any sense of how many miles you covered?
It'd be a total guesstimate. I'm guessing about 80, 90 miles. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. So you're making reasonable miles each day.
Yeah, slow down. There's a couple of days with big portages where you would cover much, much less. So on average, something like that.
Yeah. What did you seeing that as a second descent? I assume was when you went down that river. Yeah.
First time I've been there, so it was a first descent for me.
Would you have wanted to do the first descent, or were there a lot of actual? You had to roll the dice on some of the gorges you went into.
Yeah, I mean, you would have been scrambling around for a long time. I'm just really grateful that I got to see it. I don't really mind whether I was first or last there, because sadly some of that has been dammed as well now. I think it's gone.
Really?
Yeah. But I think the whole Iranian experience is sort of worth commenting on as well, because it's so fabulous. There is this Islamic tenet to treat guests like you, or treat travelers as guests like you would treat yourself. And so we stayed with a little guy in Sepidasht, and we went into his house, and he said, "This is my house. You stay here. I give you food. I treat you like my guest." We didn't buy any food while we were staying at his house, and he wouldn't allow us to either.
Did you have a translator with you on this trip?
Dave. So that southwestern portion of Iran eclipses some of the Kurdish homeland that sort of is split by Turkey and Iraq, and Manby speaks Kurdish, fortunately.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
But
impressive.
It's former English colony, so there is a legacy of English there as well,
so
and a lot of people speak.
Really?
Very good English. Really? Yeah, I'd say more than Japan actually. Surprisingly, yeah.
That surprises me a lot. Yeah.
But one of the stories I love the most is sepidashed. I'm a dirtbag kayaker in the middle of nowhere. I'll go and get a haircut. It'll be a couple of bucks, so I don't have to spend the same one. 10 times as much when I come home. And I wandered into this little barber in Sebadasht, and the barber was sat in the back, and his mate was reading the paper in the chair where people get their hair cut. And he welcomes me in, and his mate goes off, and he asks me what kind of haircut I want. We start off, and his mate goes off and tells everybody in the village that there's an Englishman in the town. And so by the time he's finished cutting my hair, there's 40 people in this barber shop asking me about Tony Blair, George Bush, the war in Iraq,
No way.
what I think about it, because they don't have access to this information. So they wanted to know that. And
They wanted to cut through all the censorship that exists in the country.
For sure. I mean, I was an alternative source for them. And then come the end of it, I asked the guy, how much can I pay for the haircut? And he says, no, you're a guest in my country. You don't pay.
Whoa.
Which was humbling.
Amazing.
And then just to follow that up at the end of the trip, like 6 weeks later, I thought I'll go and get a cheap haircut. I can pay him, and then at least we're square on this. And same thing, his mate's reading the paper in the barber's chair. He's like picking his nails at the back. Welcome back. How are you? How is Iran? How is Iran? And his mate disappears. Everybody comes in. They want to know, how was Iran? Do you love Iran? Do you love Iran? And, we had a fabulous time talking about the trips, and they were fascinating. And we come to the end of the haircut, and I go to the guy, like, how much are you? He goes, no, you're a guest in my country. You don't pay.
Incredible.
Yeah. Humbling, actually, I think.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. Humbling. Yeah. What was the thing that surprised you most about being immersed in that culture for a little bit?
I think that's quite interesting, actually, because got to learn to read between the lines of international reporting, because what we see from Iran today is certainly happening, but it's filtered by agendas, and there's a lot of really good people on the ground just trying to live their lives and get on with it, like there are in a lot of countries.
Yeah. I hear that so much. Yeah. I mean, even just our neighbor to the south, right? You hear so many things about Mexico, but people's experience there just tends to be good people and beautiful places. Yeah. Well, that's super interesting. Would you ever go back there, do you think?
I was thinking about that the other day, actually. Really? And I'd have to cut through what I'm reading about Iran right now. I mean, it's difficult. I think I would, yeah. We're back with Tales from the Crips with Kevin Cripps and his daughter, Katie, who's just about to ask me a question.
I heard that you did a first descent in Laos. Were you barefoot?
Where did you hear that? I'm just kidding. It is highly likely that I was barefoot. It's most likely. I mean, it's warm, big water. I was almost certainly in a little slicey playboat, which was made of 1960s plastic, probably. So yeah, I was barefoot.
All the criteria are there for barefoot.
Right. Exactly.
Aren't you worried about stepping on poisonous things, or?
Yeah, I mean, I worry about more other stuff. I mean, I was just talking to you now. I just came back from the Embudo. I was barefoot there, but
of course,
when I got back, my partner was telling me she was reading about rattlesnakes there, and that was something that had never occurred to me. Really, I was too worried about the rapids.
Ignorance is bliss, huh?
Yeah.
So the Mekong River was your destination in Laos?
Yep. So I was there with a solid bunch of characters for a kayaking competition that was sponsored by Thai Airways. And they had one segment in northern Thailand which had the most boring whitewater but the greatest food. And then the second section was in Indonesia, on the Asahan River coming out of the jungle there, which actually had quite fantastic whitewater, big volume in the jungle, but terrible food. But the guy who organised it had pointed out to us that there was this section on the Mekong on the border with Cambodia that could be worth a little bit of a look. And so we went across with old gang buddies of mine. One of my favourite characters that I've travelled and paddled with the most is Brad Ludden, who's now, taken charge of first descents, set that up.
Yeah, he was from Montana, right?
Yeah, he is. That's right. Yeah,
I paddled with someone who was who learned from his family when he was a kid.
Yeah, super character. And so he's gone on and set up the kayaking camps for kids with cancer. And then there was Tyler Curtis.
I've heard that name.
He was a former Canadian team member and dirtbag international globe-trotting kayaker. which I did a bunch in Patagonia with as well, actually. And Mikey Abbott, people would probably know. Benno Hort, who's sadly passed on from Norway. So we went out and had a go at this section, and what it turned out to be was another geographical anomaly like the Zambezi. So the Mekong is huge at that stage. It's very close to the ocean. You're talking kilometers wide, and when you're on the riverbank, you look out towards the river one way, and then you look in the other direction. As far as you can see, there are houses on stilts, so the river gets a lot bigger when it's up as well. And anyway, we got to the section called 1,000 Islands, I think it was called, and there's basically a band of rock, like a dam, runs across the river. And to get across it, the river flares to about 10 kilometers and just cuts all these channels through this 10-meter band of rock. And those channels can be 3 to 6 meter waterfalls, or they can be Zambezi Nile-esque huge pumping volumes or channels of white water, which are rugged and hard, and they will end in this big pool at the bottom, and you walk back up and do the next one. And they all come together in the pool at the bottom, which has pink dolphins in it, just to round off
That's so cool.
Yeah, the uniqueness of it.
Yeah. It sounds extremely unique.
Yeah.
Was the expedition a full success? Was it something that...
It was a full success in that we came back with hangovers and we were all alive, and we did some whitewater that was super challenging that we'd never seen before. So it worked out pretty well. So at the time when I was doing a lot of this stuff for Iran, for the Mekong, I was making movies on VHS and selling them just to keep the dream alive, as a side hustle to keep traveling. And so that was part of a movie that I put together with a section of the Orinoco in Venezuela. I think we put the Baker from the Pascua in there, and maybe the section from Iran as well.
Can you still get those videos, or are they out there?
You can get them. I can sell them to you. You've just got to get a VHS player.
Oh, there you go.
I think a lot of stuff's online if you look for it. Okay. People have posted it online.
Yeah. I don't know that I've really. I think I've seen clips of some of those, but certainly not all. Is this an example of something where you look at this river, like, I did it once, it was cool, or is this something that could be a classic that people should go repeat?
Well, it is a classic that people should go and repeat, and I think people do go back and do it. It's again a fabulous cultural travel story, because you can live on the Central Islands. There were small backpacking lodges there. We used to get people with carts with water buffalo to carry our boats across the island back to the lodges. Cheap food, cheap beer. I mean, it's a wonderful destination. I had a great time there. For me, the rivers that I love that continually draw me back are the big water play rivers like Zambezi and the Futalefu in Chile that I love and adore. Yeah. And to a lesser extent, stuff like the Embudo and California. I love that stuff, but I'm not as rugged as I used to be. Right.
Yeah. Is it why? I was going to say, why do you think that is? Is that the reason? It's easier on your body?
Yeah. Pain dwells a little bit longer. Aches, and I'm focusing on other stuff, trying to keep my business going, production and photography, and it's been good in the last couple of years. So
that's great to hear. Yeah. Are you still traveling a lot for that photography business? Or?
Yeah, a lot. I work as a private videographer, photographer for a family that owns quite a lot of property in Africa, and do a lot of conservation work there, which has preserved a lot of land and put a lot of endangered species on a much better footing. So I make private videos for them, but I also generate a lot of beautiful wildlife stills for them, which is one of the reasons I do it. An old character that I've worked with a lot, John Bowermaster, you would find online, Googling quite quickly. I did a piece in the Maldives in October on coral reef restoration. So a lot of the places are beginning to actually cement and plant hybridized coral where it's been bleached in the hope that they can regenerate the reefs.
Oh, really?
So we did a documentary on that. And then I have another character who I filmed going into the Marianas Trench 2 years ago. And he's decided he likes jumping out of custom-made balloons at 35,000 feet. So I've been filming him doing that kind of nonsense.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds like a great way to make some money and keep the adventure alive in your life. This sounds like an interesting gig.
Yep. I've just made volunteer ski patrol at Copper, so a different direction again.
No shortages of things to do in the world, I guess, for you.
No, for sure.
Yeah. What would you? So, out of all these decades of paddling, what if you're stuck in one place? Where would it be?
Oh, Zambezi.
It is.
Happiest time of my life.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. Mind-boggling on so many levels. I mean, the river, because it's changing all the time, because it does what I love and need, which is challenging whitewater, but also super play features everywhere. Nothing like a big wave for me. I just love that. It just does it for me. But also working amongst this very, very diverse group of characters. So, people drawn from all over the world with this common interest again, not all kayakers, but just a love of the river, a love of life. And life was pretty good then.
I always hear people getting sick out there. Is that a factor at all, or do you have all the antibodies that you need in your body now to handle that river?
I think bacteria get sick when they come onto me. So, I think you get used to it. It's not a dirty river. I mean, you're more likely to have GI issues in Himalayas than you are on this river for sure.
Yeah, I think someone told me it was maybe more just the eating and the sanitary stuff outside of the river. But
yeah, I think it's that's just a function of travel experience, right? Learning to recognize what to eat and just letting your stomach toughen up a little bit.
Yeah, so in your mind, it's not much different than just traveling anywhere.
Not at all. Not at all.
Interesting.
Fabulous culture as well. Again, Zimbabwe, awesome people. Yeah.
What's the most difficult thing you've ever done kayaking? Not in terms of hard whitewater per se, but just the experience itself, the challenge.
Ooh, that's a really good question. Murchison Falls was up there in terms of trying to hold it together because I found that quite high pressure. The whitewater you can manage pretty well, but the wildlife is a real random that you can't manage. Walking to the Kings that's pretty epic.
Maybe it'd be easier with shoes. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it doesn't make it any shorter.
No, it doesn't.
Still the same length. Still got to get up 3,000 feet to 12,000 foot pass and come back down again. So you got to use your legs for that. I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. I mean, I've just been very blessed. I've managed to see a tremendous amount of the world from my kayak and through my kayak, and I've stayed safe so far.
Yeah, that's fantastic. What about what would be your worst the close call that was the closest call? Maybe in a hot tub and
maybe my closest call was the fact that I might at one stage have had to have given Rolf mouth to mouth. I mean that is beyond thinking about.
I don't know. He's a decent looking guy.
Yeah, I wouldn't be first in the line for that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, seriously. Have you had any close calls on the river?
Of course. It's the nature of kayaking. Yeah. Had a little run-in with the rapid on the Zambezi once where I was held under in rocks for a little while, and it was kind of a close run thing. I don't talk about that too much, but I think, we lose paddlers, and we've got to remember that it is real, and we've got to remember why we're doing it, and that, the excitement of one class 5 is not worth all the other class 4s that we would run for the rest of our life and all the people that we would meet doing that. And it's very tempting when you're young to put that stuff first, and I've done it for sure. I just hope that everybody gets this opportunity to get their ass kicked really hard, but to walk away from it so they can understand it.
Yeah, learn the lesson without it.
Yeah, when it goes wrong, the river doesn't stop.
Yeah. What would be your advice to someone that hears kind of about your decades of paddling and your adventures and all the places you've been, and maybe they're teenagers or 20 years old, and they're like, oh, I want to experience this life.
Don't do it. Get a job. Get a life. Then I can keep the river to myself. I mean, if you know anything about kayaking and this lights a fire in your soul, follow your heart.
How would you advise people to make it sustainable? Put it that way.
Ooh. See, I'm a kayaker, not an economic advisor. But
is it Bitcoin? Is that the answer?
Yeah, that's right. And that's why you should invest in. No. I mean, it evolves all the time. So the job that I had on the Zambezi video kayaker doesn't really exist, or certainly doesn't exist for foreigners anymore. I don't know that. I think the answer is that everybody's journey is different, and you have to follow your nose and follow your heart and research and speak to people, find out what's going on.
Yeah, the opportunities unfold as you experience it. Huh?
Yeah. Practice on being competent where you can first. Yeah, I don't have a great answer for that one, I'm afraid,
That's fair.
Yeah.
That's fair. All right, well, thanks, Alex.
Hey, my pleasure.
Yeah,
my pleasure.
Any parting thoughts?
Not really, no. If you're looking for photos to put on your bathroom wall, alexnix.com is a great place to get fine art photography, I've heard. Otherwise, I'm really grateful to have been able to share some of these experiences with you. I feel, humbled to have seen what I've done. I'm really grateful to have seen that. It was my passion when I was younger, and if somebody had told me I'd have done as much as I have kayaking, I wouldn't have believed them. But there's a lot of time out there, so take it sensibly, take it cautiously, and go and enjoy and explore.